We are closely following the footsteps of Jesus during the last week of his life. A substantial part of each of the four Gospels is a report of Jesus' last week. A great many things happened in those 7 days, beginning with Palm Sunday when he entered the gates of Jerusalem. We're going to look at 3 of those events this morning. They happened one right after the other. First, the good. Oh, let me point out something. We noticed the church sign out front. The good, the bad, the ugly potato bar. I love it. First, the good. Much emphasis is given to Peter's denial of Jesus on the night of his arrest, and we'll get to that shortly. But before considering Peter's failure of nerve, let's look at his acts of courage that preceded his 3 denials. After the Last Supper, Jesus predicted that the disciples would all desert him. And Peter replied, and this is from Mark 14, "Even though all of them will become deserters, I will not." And then Peter said, "Even though I must die with you, Lord, I will not deny you." Can you feel Peter's earnest desire to stand with Jesus no matter what the cost? I can see that in those words. When Judas arrived with the temple guards and the guard went to seize Jesus, it was Peter who drew the sword of one of the guards and actually cut off the ear of one of the guards. That particular part of the story, I think, gets lost so easily. And of course, Jesus reattached it, as only the Savior and God's Son can do. Peter certainly appears to have been willing to stand by his words when he said, "I would be willing to die with you." Then, after Jesus was seized, the other disciples fled. They're not there. Peter alone followed the guards, though at a distance so as not to be seen with Jesus. Finally, when Jesus was taken into the high priest's house, Peter actually dared to enter that courtyard where many of the guards who had just seized Jesus were standing. These are hardly the actions of a coward. They're just not. I dare say it took remarkable courage for Peter to enter the courtyard that night and to follow Jesus from one scene to the other. I know that I have never acted with such courage at any point in my lifetime. This is the good part of the story. As Jesus went on trial before the Sanhedrin, Peter stood in the courtyard of the high priest. And here we find the bad part of the story. Peter was surrounded by people who were willing to testify against Jesus in his trial. And 3 times Peter was confronted and asked whether he was a follower of Jesus. And 3 times Peter denied it. There are at least 3 things to note in this story of Peter's denials. First, Peter could have left the courtyard after the servant girl accused him of being a follower. He could have left right then. While it is true that he denied Jesus, he didn't leave the courtyard. Why? Because Peter loved Jesus. And that is so very clear as we read these stories. Second, we should note the way that Peter's denial affected him. That last verse, remember what it said? And he went out and wept bitterly. Peter knew what he had done. Third, this story is told in all 4 of the Gospels, despite the fact that it would have been deeply embarrassing for Peter. Why did all 4 Gospel writers include this part of the story? I believe it is because Peter had told it again and again and again himself as he spread the message in faraway places. Telling the story could have been his way of saying, look, I denied knowing the Lord on that night when he was put on trial, but after his resurrection, he took me back and he restored me. And by his grace, I am what I am today. I think it was Peter who couldn't help but tell his own story. And what a magnificent story it is. Had Peter done a bad thing? Yes. He denied Jesus. And let's not forget, Jesus had told Peter that he was going to do such a thing just a few hours earlier. And sure enough, Peter denied his Lord. And he wept bitterly. Peter had done a bad thing. After the Sanhedrin had finished with Jesus and found him guilty and worthy of death, we are presented with what I call the ugly part of the story. Judas was suddenly overcome with remorse for having betrayed Jesus. We know this is true because the text reads, when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned to die, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the priest and the elders. Judas said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And then with great speed, the gospel writer brings this part of the story to a conclusion with this one sentence. Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, Judas departed and he went out and hanged himself. In other words, Judas took his own life. What Judas did to Jesus was ugly. What Judas did to himself was ugly. What might have happened had Judas hung on for 3 days? Had he waited 3 days, he would have seen the other side of his very own betrayal. He would have seen Jesus raised from the dead. Had he seen the risen Christ and fallen on his knees at Jesus' feet, asking for mercy, what do you think Jesus would have done with Judas? I think you and I already know what Jesus would have done. Now imagine the witness that Judas would have had to share as he spread the gospel. You can almost hear him give his own personal witness. He could say something like, I so loved the things of this world, and I so believed in the hope of a revolution against the Roman government that I actually sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But I'm here to tell you today that the grave could not hold him down, and after his resurrection, Jesus forgave me. If he can forgive me for the terrible thing I did, don't you know that his grace is sufficient for you? Can you see the witness that only one person in the entire world could give a testimony like that? The one who betrayed Jesus Christ. But Judas didn't wait 3 days. The good. Peter at first acted courageously. The bad. Peter eventually denied Jesus. The ugly. Judas betrayed Jesus and then took his own life. If you stand back and look at those 3 words, the good, the bad, the ugly, those words eventually describe each one of us at different times in our lives. Oh, I know. We haven't betrayed Jesus like Judas did. And Jesus did die for the sins of all people, you and me alike. All of us helped put Jesus on that cross. There's a good side to us. We've all got it. We certainly see it in each other. But a good side is in you, every one of you. And sometimes it's even in me. Judas took his own life. I'm afraid that many people who end up doing that have lost sight of their own goodness. And maybe they've lost sight of life's goodness too. There's a good side to you. There's a bad side too. We look at a newborn baby and we can see the true innocence of that child. She's never acted yet from jealousy or anger or meanness. She is, as they say, pure as the driven snow. And then one day, she becomes a teenager. That's when her mother is too controlling, her father is too old-fashioned, and she's embarrassed to even be seen with her family in public. What happened to her innocence? Where did that go? The Garden of Eden is what happened to her innocence. Suddenly, the teenager knows more than the rest of the family around her. And just like Eve thought she knew what she wanted more than God knew what she needed. Then, there can be an ugly side to us. Ugly is worse than bad. Bad can involve things like selfishness, even self-righteousness, and certainly blindness to one's own faults. Bad blames, but ugly condemns and wants to destroy. Ugly aims at bringing hurt and harm to someone else. Ugly is motivated by the hatred of revenge. Ugly, if it goes unchecked, murders and rapes and abuses and enslaves. These traits of ugly might seem far more severe than anything you have actually ever done in your life, but these extremes don't have to be acted upon in order to be sinful. Remember what Jesus said about unfaithfulness in marriage? Remember what he said? Even if you have lust in your heart. Even if you have lust in your heart, you are sinning. The mere desire, not the action of acting it out, the mere desire is a sin. We have good, we sometimes succumb to bad, and we are capable of ugly. I'm not going to get caught up in it, not because it could be looked upon in a political way. I'm not worried about that on this issue. But look at what ISIS is doing in this world. They're not fighting a war. They are murdering and raping and killing innocent people. That's ugly. That's as ugly as it gets. Jesus forgave and restored Peter, but Judas died unforgiven and unrestored. What was the difference between those two? Peter loved Jesus for who and what Jesus was. Judas had followed Jesus, hoping that he would do what Judas wanted him to do. Lead an uprising against the Roman authorities. Peter loved Jesus for Jesus' sake. Judas followed Jesus to see what might be in it for him. Some time ago, I read a love letter that a young woman wrote to her former fiancé. They had planned to get married. They had set the date. They had begun making the wedding arrangements, and then all of a sudden the young woman broke the engagement and said that she had fallen madly in love with someone else. But it was only a few days after that apparently this young woman had a change of heart. So she wrote the young man a letter. Dear Tommy, can you ever forgive me? No words can express how badly I feel, how terribly unhappy I've been since breaking off our engagement. I can't eat, I can't sleep. I can't do anything without thinking of you. Please take me back. Tommy, please. No one could ever take your place in my heart. I love you, I love you, I love you. And it was signed, yours forever, Marie. And at the bottom, there was this little postscript, and it said, by the way, Tommy, congratulations on winning the lottery. That's the kind of sincerity that Judas had for Jesus. It was entirely, what's in it for me? Compare that with Peter. I love him, I love him. Oh my Lord, I denied him. And then Jesus restored him. You see the difference? There is a huge difference. I think sometimes it would do us well to think of God and to try to love God, to praise God simply for His sake. For His sake. I think it would sometimes be good to simply thank God for who He is, with no other motive and no other purpose other than to simply thank God for who He is. In this coming week, before you share your personal request for God, and don't ever stop doing that, the various ways that you need His help, always share that. But I encourage you this week that before in your prayers you get to your needs, simply take time to tell God how much you love Him simply for His sake.